Hello and welcome to the Working Tools Masonic Podcast, where today will be part 2 of our discussion of stewardship of our buildings.
Ladies and gentlemen, brethren all, welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, a casual conversation around Freemasonry. First, it's important to note that our opinions and thoughts are our own and do not reflect those of our Grand Lodge or respective craft or concordant bodies. Please connect with us and ask questions, either here on YouTube or on our Facebook page. We'd also appreciate a thumbs up and especially any comments on our videos.
The Working Tools Masonic Podcast, where we'll be discussing stewardship of the buildings that our lodges meet in. I'm Matt Appel, a Mason here in the Grand Lodge of Washington, and with us today we have our usual hosts, Worshipful Brother Stephen Chung, who is a member of a lodge out in the Grand Lodge of British Columbia and Yukon, very Worshipful Brother David Colbeth, a member of a lodge here in Washington, and very Worshipful Brother Chris Haynes, who in addition to being a Mason here in Washington, is the chairman of the Grand Lodge Real Estate Advisory Committee for the Grand Lodge of Washington. Thanks again for being here with us, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
So last time we started sort of discussing broad strokes about whether or not a lodge should own a building and sort of the importance of that. And so we sort of delved down over time, and we kind of left it on the idea of reserves for various purposes. And we talked about building inspections and being prepared for roofs specifically, but what are some other sort of issues that frequently come up and you guys experience, again, as building owners, as well as members of lodges that own buildings more specifically, that lodges need to, or temple boards need to consider and set money aside for?
Go for it, Chris.
Well,
throw you under the building.
Oh, throw me under the building. Well, any aspects of the physical aspect of the building are things that you should save for and reserve for. We touched on that in our last episode. But some other things to think about too is what kind of legal resources do you want to have money set aside for? Insurance. And Stephen, it sounds like that's kind of a hot button in your world, and hope that you talk a little bit more about that. But believe it or not, also having money set aside for brokerage. And what I mean by that is if you typically will have two different kinds of building configurations for most lodges. Some will be a single-use building. They have a big assembly hall, maybe they have a dining room, maybe they have a kitchen, but it's pretty much going to be used for like a whole bunch of different events at different times. I know some lodges do like banquets, quinceaneras, kinds of big activities and that sort of thing.
They function kind of like a church or some kind of a community center. It's single purpose. They don't have any other, maybe a single story or whatever.
Exactly. And then other lodges will maybe have some commercial space available within their building footprint. And my lodge has that up in Bothell, where we have 2 commercial spaces on the main floor, we have cell towers on the top of the building, and we actually generate steady monthly income from the commercial properties down there. But I also know some lodges that do an excellent job in renting out their assembly halls for events and are very successful at it. And even some others that I've also heard of are branching out and upgrading their kitchens to a commercial kitchen status and renting out the kitchens for food trucks and other food preparation vendors out there, and are branching out their income opportunities.
Yeah.
This is your typical configuration, 2 different kind of scenarios. And David, I believe that your building does a lot of like banquets and assembly work. And in fact, you partnered with somebody who actually has a website and has a whole package where they rent that building out on a consistent basis, and they actually they handle that entire process from soup to nuts, don't they?
Well, we did.
You did. Past tense. Okay.
We did, and he actually decided he didn't want to do that anymore. So, like most Masons that can't say no, or maybe didn't step backwards fast enough, I handle that role now actually as rental manager. But yes, we do a pretty steady outside. We call them outside rentals. The person that we're talking about, Kyle Grafstrom, we actually may have him on the show at some point in the future. He actually wrote a book about masonry in the Wild West, and so at some point we've got a long docket of people that we want to have on the show, and at some point we'd like to have him on. But he actually manages the Kent Masonic Hall, as well as I think Des Moines Masonic Hall and Renton Masonic Hall, and in another non-Masonic venue. He has a business that he does that with. And yeah, Kent, I was going to mention that Zane McCune, who is a member of the Kent Masonic Hall there and Verity Lodge, they do a booming business. They're a single-story, single-use type building, exactly what you're talking about. But they rent that Friday, Saturday, Sunday, every weekend, every day. It's actually hard for them to do any other rentals in that building. For example, we were at the Rainbow, Matt and I were talking about, we were at a Rainbow event today on a Sunday. It's just a little bit different, but that was one of the only days that were available in that hall to have. And because they rent it for a lot of money. They've done a great job with the upkeep and of the maintenance, and they're doing continual process improvements to that building. I don't know what the numbers are, but they're significant, tens and tens of thousands of dollars in revenue. They make as much or more than if they had a first floor with retail. So in our building, we're similar. We have a 7,000 square foot footprint. And on the first floor, we have about 6,000 or so square feet of rentable space, and it is all currently rented. And we're trying. One of the problems has been a very large space didn't have continual increases in lease amounts over the last 30 years, and so they're paying significantly below market rates. But we just starting in January, just finally got them bumped up a little bit, and with the understanding they're going to continue to have incremental increases over the next time. And we carved out a little space for another tenant that we've had in there for the last year, and then he's leaving, but a new tenant just came in. I think things happen as if by magic, and we have a new tenant that's going to take over that space. And and then we have actually three spaces down there, and a third one has been rented, and they're about halfway through their 5-year lease. And it is pretty close to market rates, which are relatively low for Auburn, but it's an old 1920s building and it hasn't been upgraded. So, but then we do rent the upstairs. We have lots. We have 9 organizations plus a church that meets in our building. And I still do, our numbers last year were about $16,000 in outside rentals that I did last year. So we're doing pretty well on the income side. We just spent over the last 5 years or so, it's approximately $300,000 not spent, I shouldn't say. We've had about $300,000 worth of work done to our building as a restoration project. And the building was changed in the 50s to the old steel and cheap glass storefronts. And so we just had them restored to the 1920s Douglas fir, beautiful double pane windows. And it's really a beautiful job. But a couple of our members stepped up and did all the paperwork and all the process to get that done. We were able to take advantage of some amazing grants that were available through the city as well as through the county. I think out of that $300,000 or so, we only spent about $50,000 to $75,000 to get all that done. So it was an amazing opportunity. So I'd highly recommend anybody out there that needs to do improvements, check with your local municipalities, check with your county, your development groups. Ask around. There's probably grants and things available, even for painting, even as simple as painting. So definitely check with them for grants. But also don't spend a lot of time spinning your wheels on grants. Make sure that the building is profitable. And as Chris was starting to talk about, that single use versus retail use, I think we're just about to get into some of that retail ability. Are leases current? Is the income, is it marketable income? You know, If it's not, check, and you don't know, just like you would inspect the property, have an inspector come out and have an inspection done, hire a commercial broker, hire a property manager to come out and say, hey, can you evaluate this interior of the building and tell me what it would be worth to rent? What should I be charging right now?
Well, that's one of the things that we, the holding society decided to do. We had a tenant change or leave, and we were well below current market and didn't really realize it, I suppose. From what I understand, they hired a property manager to lease the space for us, and they got us several dollars more per square foot than we were getting before. Yes, we paid a huge fee for them to do that and put the person in there, but you only pay that fee once, and I guess once that lease is done, at least then we're at a better market rate than we were, because we didn't realize that we were several dollars per square foot below market, right?
Yeah.
So there's some real benefits to hiring the right people.
Yeah, and if you just keep those rates moving upward with the market, it's relatively easy to get a new analysis done to understand where the number should be and not have to do a full, okay, we haven't done this in 50 years, how much should we be charging? Or if you have a tenant that doesn't have a lease, what's your legal position if they'd stop paying the lease? You know, having that legal team, having a good broker, property manager, attorney, having all those professionals at your fingertips is critical.
And I think that you guys having that committee in Washington for lodges to look to for support when they have to deal with these things for the first time and are not very aware, I think that's great.
So just to step back a second to the topic of the set-asides that were not, I don't know what you want to call them, the sinking funds, the money that the Temple Board is setting aside for expenses. We sort of talked about physical things to the building, and Chris was talking about legal and potential other professional expenses. And I think you guys sort of hit on one without actually mentioning it, which is, it seems to me, as a member of a lodge that does not own its own building, that if your tenants just go out of business, or or their lease expires and they decide to move, or they retire, or whatever it is, and suddenly you have half or all of your rental space is empty, you're still going to need to keep the heat on and the lights on, and if that rental was supporting your lodge room upstairs, you're going to need to have some money set aside to keep the show running, essentially.
Absolutely, and you want to plan very generously, potentially, for that what's called a vacancy, right? It can take a while to load a commercial space with a property, and a rule of thumb that we've used in our lodge is, do we comfortably have a year worth of rent set aside in for that particular rental to give us the space to be able to have another tenant come in, and that doesn't even include the brokerage cost by hiring a professional broker to load that space.
So Chris, you were breaking up a little bit. You said a year. You plan for about a year's worth of rental income, just in case there's a long-term vacancy or a little more hard finding a new tenant to replace that.
Correct.
And I was going to ask, if you want to stab in the dark at the gray area between the lines in our code, our constitutions of Washington, that as they say, the code is silent in that area, talking about how much should a Temple Board have? I mean, that's just rental income if they're losing rental income. But what if they have a building that needs some maintenance? Or how do you know how much to set aside? Now, we talked about in the previous show getting an inspector out to give you an idea of the quality and condition of your roof, and what other elements might an inspection include?
They could be looking at what are the different components of the interior of the property, for instance, the condition of the carpeting, flooring, like that. Height is expected in what you currently have for any major component. It's really hard for a lot of brothers that are trying to help manage a building to look at it from the perspective of a commercial property. A lot of people's reference point is for their own homes. Or if they belong to, say, like a condominium or a homeowners association. People who live in condominiums that have reserve studies get that concept actually pretty well, especially if they're active on their boards.
Yeah, for sure.
There are some condo owners that don't participate and they don't have a clue. But people who actually work on a homeowner association board actually will have reference point in understanding the power of good reserves. They obviously understand special assessments. People sometimes hear about that, but that's where it's a sudden cash infusion by every member of that association to feed into that to pay for a major cost right away. Well, that's no different than for lodges that turn to their members and say, you know what, we need $1,000 from each member to be able to put a new roof on or whatever. I mean, some major outlay. That would be like a special assessment for each member of that lodge if they so chose and they didn't have the reserves in place to do that. And just to kind of touch on a quick thing here, just to be really clear, these reserves, these capital funds, if you will, would not be in the they would be kept in the lodge. The Temple Association, at least for us, for best practices, only has enough cash on hand to cover typical taxes, insurance, operating costs, if you will, throughout the year. And so I just wanted to kind of throw that in there, at least from Washington Masonic Code, that we don't want to have large cash reserves building in our temple associations.
Right, millions and millions of dollars. That seems to get people in trouble when their bank accounts are flush like that.
Well, and they lose sight of the purpose, and the whole point of a title holding corporation is to limit the liability just to that building.
Yeah.
Don't park all your cash in there. Just saying.
Yeah. I think the rule of thumb has been basically a year, maybe as much as 2 years if you're doing a particular capital improvement that's going to be happening very quickly. But yeah, just enough. I mean, but that can be significant. I mean, our building, it costs about $75,000 to $90,000 a year to run that building, and so there can be some significant funds that need to be spent. But those are spent. It's not just sitting around. It's usually a flow of money.
Right, and so that's why on your team of professionals, really good accounting is going to really be full. How do you analyze your income and expenses for your building association? Just to kind of clarify too, for lodges, is to understand the difference between gross leases and triple net leases. And I touched a little bit on this. Some lodges like to use gross leases because those are really easy to calculate. I'm making up a number here. Give me $3,000 a month, let you rent the space. And from that $3,000 a month, we're going to cover our taxes, our rents, and our building maintenance and all that kind of thing. The only problem is, though, is unless you bake in automatic increases into your gross lease from year to year, you can actually start eroding your income by not keeping up changing taxes and insurance and maintenance costs for your building. So I really have found that a good hedge, if you will, for those rising costs is to consider using what's called a triple net lease. A triple net lease is basically the commercial tenant spaces portion. Let's say they have 25% of the building. So they would have 25% of all the tax costs for that property, 25% of all the common area maintenance costs of that building, oftentimes with a cap, and then 25% of the insurance costs of the old building. And that's a great way of forcing the building association to pay attention to its expenses on an annual basis, because you have to provide an accounting of that to your commercial tenants to say, this is how your rents are now adjusting this year based upon these increased costs. And it's all about how you bake in active management of your building. Don't just sign a lease and fire and forget, and the checks keep cashing, it must be good. by having an ongoing process of actively reviewing those expenses, you won't let them get away from you. So everybody here has touched on that issue where all of a sudden there's a realization that, oh my goodness, we're not even near market rate on our rentals that we're charging. I think when I first joined my building association, we were at 20% of market rate on our rental rates. And I was just shocked because I have some of my own rentals personally, but it was just like, this is absolutely critical that this be analyzed. And so we went through a process of adjusting the rents, but also first getting new commercial tenants. Once the tenants that were, and this was ironic too, is that these tenants weren't even making their payments on time, even at 20% of market rate. So they were terrible tenants.
Yeah.
And as I always tell people, I says, don't be sad when the end of a lease is coming up. It could be a great opportunity to get a better tenant. I mean, or if you have a really good tenant, great, adjust it. They have increasing costs for their business. You have increasing costs for your business of your building. It's fair. And that's all this is. It's fair. And Stephen, you touched on the fiduciary responsibility of a building association that they have to their stakeholders. And absolutely, this is a critical piece that's overlooked. And really can't say enough about it in terms of active management of your buildings.
Yeah, one of the things that they got into in their fiduciary duty was the insurance factor, which of course did have a dramatic effect on the overall cost of running the building. Once we bought the proper insurance, it cost a lot more. For example, director and officers liability insurance. When you realize that every member of your lodge belongs to the society that owns the lodge, every member of your lodge is equally responsible or liability wise. So then you look at the insurance factor to make sure that you're covered for those things, because theoretically, if you don't have the right insurance in place, somebody slips and falls on the sidewalk in front, they could sue your lodge and every member of the lodge, and now all of us are on the hook legally. And so that's one of the reasons that started looking into it, was because that scenario was put forth, and sure enough, we were not properly insured. So all these years we've been doing business as it just continued on, and nobody even thought of those things. So another good thing to consider is that.
So Stephen, to step back a topic for a second, the other two guys were talking about how here in Washington, the rule essentially is that you can't hold more or less a year's worth of expenses in the Temple Corporation. Does it work similarly in BC? Do you have to essentially turn over all the excess assets of the Temple Corporation to the owners at the end of the year, or does it? Do you know how does that works up there?
No, I don't believe they turn anything over. They have sustainability funds that are invested for the long-term usage for the lodge, right? I'm not exactly sure how they have that structured, but last report I heard, we had I think $300,000 in our long-term investments for the sustainability of the lodge. So if we needed to, we could pull from that.
And does the lodge own that, or is it the Temple Corporation own that? Do you know?
The Temple Corporation owns that.
Okay. Really?
Wow.
Yes. So the holding society has all the marbles in their basket. Each lodge has members on the holding society, but they're not. It's a separate entity.
But just hypothetically, for the sake of argument, if the Temple board ran $1 million profit one year and had all this money on hand, would they and it was, far in excess of what they foresaw for expenses for the foreseeable future, would they then hand that money back to the owners of the Temple Corporation, or would they hang on to it? And
they would hang on to it for the Kelowna Holding Society to invest properly for future use.
Interesting. So the building is not really a revenue source for the lodge then, necessarily?
No, actually, it's not a revenue source for the lodge, though in one sense it is, that because it makes enough money to support itself, our lodges don't have to pay rent. Well, we do pay rent. We pay $1 per year per member, right? So we get a good deal on rent because we have the income from it. But no, it doesn't. Like if they run, like for example, now they're going to make more money this year off of that one tenant. We wouldn't see any excess funds be distributed from the holding society. It would just be put into the bank and invested for future use. Because I know that there is a future plan. Eventually, they'll sell our building and we'll buy into another property and do something different. I know that the long-term community plan for Kelowna, there's going to be high rises probably where we are in the long term, and it's just a matter of time until somebody puts enough dollars in front of, or zeros in after that dollar sign to get us to sell.
Interesting. I know in this area, a lot of the lodges that own their own buildings through their temple board, the building is a revenue source for the lodge. That as the other guys were saying, at the end of the year, the temple board is required to hand over essentially all the money in excess of their expectations for the coming year. And so a lot of those lodges say, woohoo, we can, we can keep our dues lower, or we can do whatever with this money that's not necessarily related to the building at all. So it's interesting that it's so different up there. Yes. I think it's smart for future planning. It just makes total sense for where they want to go. I mean, for example, the Eastern Star wants us to put in an elevator or to put in a new chairlift, but where they want it, we can't do it. We can't upgrade our building. So eventually they're giving another push right now for us to try and figure another way to do it. But the fire marshal has already said, no, we can't do it. So that'll be another bigger push for them to say, okay, time to sell our building and look at something else.
It's interesting to hear, to hear about the, I'm sorry, I don't want to, it's interesting to hear too, that you have two different, or essentially three different groups that own the building together. And I know Chris is intimately involved, our committee, but mostly Chris, intimately involved in a situation where we have in the part of our state that is a similar situation, but one of the lodges is going away or wants to move. They don't want to be in that building anymore. They don't want to have that ownership anymore. And so I'd be curious to have you recommend that you look into your contracts and to your agreements amongst the membership of that Temple Corporation to make sure it's a clear process for dissolution if necessary, which is unfortunately not so clear in this one that Chris is working on or that we're working on. And we're finding that many lodges across the state that have similar boilerplate or template style contracts are kind of clear as mud, and they're not very accurate, or the process for dissolution or for releasing that partnership is not as clear as it could be.
There was another lodge in our area that there was a building that was owned by two lodges that were members of the Temple Corporation, and their corporation bylaws had an even number of representatives from each lodge. So there was no tiebreaker. There was no, like you were saying, Eastern Star has a seat on your Temple Corporation. Ours, the one that I'm thinking of, it was exactly even. I think it was 8. It was 8 or 10. I forget which, but it was, so it was 4 and 4. And so everything that came up was deadlocked and nothing ever happened. And they ended up losing the building. So it's the dynamics of how the corporation is run are certainly very important for all of the parties concerned, from the brothers to the Eastern Star to, heck, just your tenants, right? If your building goes under, you're affecting your community around you, and that can clearly be important.
Yeah.
And with that, since I've made my point, I'm going to call time here. We approach the end of another half hour of the Working Tools Masonic podcast, and we want to again thank very worshipful brother Chris Haynes of the Grand Lodge of Washington Real Estate Advisory Committee, of which he's the chairman, and David, I suppose, is on the committee too. We'll give him some credit. And on behalf of myself and Stephen and the two aforementioned people, thank you very much for listening to our podcast.